Community Connect. Thank you and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Mr. Buford Royal Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Dr. James Wardell Bolton II of Macon, Georgia, and Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Army veteran, the Reverend Edward B. Childs of Atlanta, Georgia, formerly of Pinehurst, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Aline Adams Fields of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Jake James Lane Jr. of DeSoto, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Mr. Buford Royal Sr., better known as Pete, age 90, of 206 West 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, November 19th at the Phoebe Putnam Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Buford Royal Sr., age 90, was held Sunday, November 24th in the chapel of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Isaac H. Owens, pastor of the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, officiated. The burial followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Cora Lee Royal of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved children, Mr. Buford Royal Jr. and his spouse, Mrs. Mary Royal of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Nathaniel Royal of Warner Robins, Georgia. Mrs. Queen Evans and her spouse, Mr. Norman Evans of Birmingham, Alabama. Mrs. Brenda Green and her spouse, Deacon Whitford Green of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Buford Ross of Orlando, Florida. Mrs. Lois Adams and her husband, Mr. Sean Adams of Jacksonville, Florida. Mr. Anthony West Jr. and his spouse, Mrs. Dorothy West of St. Mary's, Georgia. Mrs. Rudine Warren and her spouse, Mr. Benny Warren of Cordele, Georgia, and Ms. Jacqueline Bond of Decatur, Georgia. A host of beloved grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. His loving and devoted sisters, Ms. Etta Peacock of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Bertha Castro of Jacksonville, Florida, his twin, Ms. Jwwilliams of Miami, Florida, his beloved brothers, Mr. Johnny Royal of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Bobby Royal and his spouse, Mrs. Florence Royal of Miami, Florida. His beloved aunt, Miss Yvonne Kennedy of Cordele, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive Mr. Buford Royal Sr., better known as Pete, age 90, of 206 West 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Dr. James Wardell Bolton II, age 54, of 1800 Wesleyan Drive, Macon, Georgia, died Sunday, November 17th at the Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for Dr. James Wardell Bolden II, age 54, was held Sunday, November 24th in the chapel of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. Elder James Patterson, pastor of the Cornerstone Ministry Church of God by Faith, officiated. His beloved cousin, Elder Terrence Walker, delivered the eulogy. The burial followed at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Shafonda Taylor Bolton of Macon, Georgia. His beloved children, Mr. Jakari Bolton of Phoenix, Arizona, Mr. Quest Bolton of Miami, Florida, and Mr. Corey Brown and his spouse, Mrs. Kathy Brown. One grandchild, his loving and devoted mother, Mrs. Carolyn Perry Bolton of Cordele, Georgia. His loving sister, Ms. Deanna Bolton of Chicago, Illinois. His beloved aunts and uncles, the Reverend Charles Perry Jr. and his spouse, Mrs. Gail Perry of Byron, Georgia. Mrs. Angela Walker and her spouse, Deacon Jesse Walker of Cordele, Georgia. Ms. Martha Stokes of Mississippi, and Bishop Ernest Morrow of Miami, Florida. His cousin, whom he treated like siblings, Ms. Catherine Vines, Minister Pamela Slayton, Mr. Eric Perry and his spouse, Ms. Kamala Perry, Ms. Trina Green and her spouse, Mr. Richard Green, Ms. Katrina McLeod, Minister Courtney Perry and his spouse, Mrs. DeQuaria Perry, Elder Terrence Walker and his spouse, Mrs. Lachelle Walker, Mrs. Deidre Pennington and her spouse, Elijah Pennington, and Miss Jasmine Walker, a host of beloved cousins, friends, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survived. Dr. James Wardell Bolton II, age 54, of 1800 Wesleyan Drive, Macon, Georgia. United States Army veteran, the Reverend Edward Bernard Childs, age 79, of 858 Shadow Ridge Drive, Southeast Atlanta, Georgia, died Tuesday, November 19th at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Army veteran, the Reverend Edward B. Childs, age 79, was held Tuesday, November 26th in the sanctuary of the Forest Chapel Baptist Church in Pinehurst, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Willie Green, officiated. The burial with military honors followed in the churchyard cemetery. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Carrie Childs of Atlanta, Georgia, his loving and caring sisters, Mrs. Johnny Mae Eccles and Miss Eloise Turner, both of Orlando, Florida, Mrs. Mildred Henderson and her spouse, Mr. Robert Henderson of Macon, Georgia, and Mrs. Louise Linkhorn of Unadilla, Georgia. His beloved brother, Deacon Robert L. Childs of Unadilla, Georgia, a beloved and devoted nephew who was raised as a brother, Deacon London Bobby Childs and his spouse, Mrs. Rosa Childs of Unadilla, Georgia. His beloved brother-in-law, Mr. Adam L. Williams, and his spouse, Mrs. Irene Williams. His devoted nieces, Miss Brittany Childs and Miss Melissa Lincoln, both Atlanta, Georgia. His beloved friends and neighbor, Mr. Jonathan Patron and Mr. Ryland O'Neill, both of Atlanta, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survived. United States Army veteran, the Reverend Edward B. Childs, age 79, of 858 Shadow Ridge Drive, Atlanta, Georgia. Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier, age 67, of 214 West 28th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, November 19, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier, age 67, was held Saturday, November 30th, in the sanctuary of the New Oak Grove Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Dion Jones officiated. The pastor, Reverend W. Wilson, delivered the eulogy. The burial followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Charles Collier of Cordele, Georgia. Her loving and devoted children, Mr. Miko Collier and his spouse, Mrs. Shamika Collier, and Mrs. Calandra Vicks and her spouse, Mr. Jimmy Vicks, both of Hampton, Georgia. 6 beloved grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, her loving and devoted sisters, Miss Omi Jean Blunt of Chapel Hill, Florida, Mrs. Denise Presley of Cordele, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Eddie Morgan and his spouse, Mrs. Jeanette Morgan, and Elder Gardner Morgan and his spouse, Mrs. Brula Morgan, both of Cordele, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survived. Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier, age 67, of 214 West 28th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Aline Adams Fields, age 70, of 806 Lincoln Street, Vienna, Georgia, died Tuesday, November 26, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Aline Adams Fields, age 70, was held Saturday, November 30th, in the sanctuary of the Free Providence Baptist Church in Vienna, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Charles Cobb Sr., officiated. The burial followed at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Deacon Roger Fields of Cordele, Georgia, her loving and devoted children, Mr. Kelsey Fields and Miss Natasha Fields Sanders of Perry, Georgia, Mr. Roger Jamal Fields and his spouse, Mrs. Jasmine Fields, Miss Alexis Fields, all of Vienna, Georgia, her loving grandchildren, Miss Radicka Thomas, Miss Janique Fields, Miss Brianna Simpson, Miss Cedrica Butler, Mr. Jacory Butler, and Mr. Jeronica Collins. 3 beloved great-grandchildren, her loving and devoted sisters, Miss Lorraine Smith of Atlanta, Georgia, Miss Shirley Jackson, and Dr. Geraldine Jones and her spouse, Mr. Robert Jones, all of Vienna, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Glenn Presley of Vienna, Georgia, Mr. Thomas Upstead of Chicago, Illinois, and Mr. Jimmy Jackson and his spouse, Mrs. Patsy Jackson of Cordele, Georgia. 8 beloved sisters-in-law, 4 brothers-in-law, a host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mrs. Aline Adams Fields, age 70, of 806 Lincoln Street, Vienna, Georgia. Mr. James Lane Jr., age 77, of 162 Mitchell Street, DeSoto, Georgia, died Thursday, November 21st, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. James Lane Jr., age 77, was held Saturday, November 30th, in the sanctuary of the Ship Chapel Baptist Church in Americus, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Daniel Clinton, officiated. The burial followed at the Eastview Cemetery in Americus, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Lottie Young Lane of DeSoto, Georgia. His loving and devoted children, Mr. Kerry Lane and his spouse, Mrs. Jackie Lane of San Diego, California. Mrs. Michelle Perry and her spouse, Mr. Wallace Perry of Leslie, Georgia. And Miss Deidre Lane of DeSoto, Georgia. 5 beloved grandchildren. A loving and devoted sister, Miss Diane Watkins of Americus, Georgia. 2 beloved brothers, Mr. Frankie Lane and his spouse, Mrs. Shirley Lane of McDonald, Georgia, and Mr. Bobby Lane of Americus, Georgia. 5 beloved sisters-in-law, 3 brothers-in-law, a host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. James Lane Jr., age 77, of 162 Mitchell Street, DeSoto, Georgia. Again, the family of Mr. Buford Royal Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Dr. James Wardell Bolden II of Macon, Georgia, and Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Army veteran, the Reverend Edward B. Childs of Atlanta, Georgia, and Pinehurst, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Aline Adams Fields of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. James Lane Jr. of DeSoto, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you is their prayer. The Jwwilliams funeral directors serving Cordele and Vienna were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. And now, it is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Retired educator and past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas, age 90, of 712 East Pine Street, Vienna, Georgia, died Sunday, November 24th, at the Emory St. Joseph Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mrs. Benita Thomas McDonald and her husband, Mr. Edison McDonald of Brookhaven, Georgia. Mr. David Reginald Thomas of Vienna, Georgia, and Mr. Gerald Earl Thomas and his spouse, Mrs. Monica Thomas of Woodstock, Georgia. His beloved grandchildren, Mr. Oliver David Thomas and Miss Olivia Nicole Thomas of Woodstock, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. Gene Thomas and his spouse, Mrs. Vanola Thomas of Evans, Georgia, and Mr. James Bernard Thomas of Savannah, Georgia. His beloved sisters-in-law, Mrs. Joanna Baldwin Thomas of Augusta, Georgia, Mrs. Mary Alice Rucker of Jamaica, New York, and Mrs. Carolyn Hunt Rucker of Hartwell, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, co-workers, and friends survived retired educator and past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas, age 90, of 712 East Pine Street, Vienna, Georgia. The funeral service for retired educator and past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas, age 90, will be held today, Sunday, November 1st, at 2 p.m. in the sanctuary of the Bethel Baptist Church in Vienna, Georgia. The pastor, the Reverend Dr. Bobby G. West, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia.
December. You said November.
Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zellner, age 70, of 314 West Madison Avenue, Ashburn, Georgia, died Sunday, November 24th at Pruitt Health in Ashburn, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Terrence Zellner of Ashburn, Georgia. Her loving and devoted children, Miss Rashandra Martin and her spouse, Mr. Collier Martin of Atlanta, Georgia. Miss Shireen Gibson and Mrs. LaWanda Bateman and her spouse, Mr. Patrick Bateman of Ashburn, Georgia. Her stepson, Mr. Arthur Roy Holmes Jr. and his spouse, Mrs. Linda Holmes of Tifton, Georgia. Her beloved grandchildren, Mr. Desmond Holmes of Albany, Georgia, Mr. Antonio Holmes Jr. of Layton, Oklahoma, Mrs. Zakiria Holmes, and Miss Shakiria Cater of Albany, Georgia, Miss Leisha Stubbins and Mr. Dequan Gibson of Ashburn, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Alexander Green Jr. of Atlanta, Georgia, and Mr. Edward Walker of Ashburn, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, to include a special nephew, Mr. Travis Quarterman of Atlanta, Georgia, and Mr. Tony Mays of Ashburn, Georgia. A host of other relatives and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zellner, age 70, of 314 West Madison Avenue, Ashburn, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zeldner, age 70, will be held today, Sunday, December 1st at 2 p.m. in the chapel of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend James Braswell will officiate. The burial will follow at the Westview Memorial Garden in Ashburn, Georgia. Mr. Wilman Lorenza Tyson Sr., age 79, of 144 Georgia Highway 308, Plains, Georgia, died Friday, November 22nd at the Phoebe Putnam Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mr. Wilma Tyson Jr., Mr. David Tyson, Miss Gloria Tyson, Mrs. Sylvia Power and her spouse, Mr. Christopher Power, Mr. Tony Tyson and his spouse, Mrs. Carlandra Tyson, Mr. Darren Tyson and his spouse, Mrs. Tanya Tyson, Miss Stephanie Hall, Mr. Cedric Tyson, and Mr. Bradley Tyson and his spouse, Mr. Brock Tyson, his beloved grandchildren and great-grandchildren, his beloved and caring sibling, Deacon R.L. Tyson, and his spouse, Mrs. Eloise Tyson, Mr. Lucius Tyson and his spouse, Mrs. Annette Tyson, Mr. Shelley Tyson and his spouse, Mrs. Isabella Tyson, Mr. Arthur James Tyson, Mrs. Catherine Harvey, Miss Leela Brown, and Miss Bernice Tyson, a host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include his special friends, Miss Gloria Tyson, his former wife and caregiver, his honorary son, Mr. Keith Frederick, and his spouse, Mrs. Pamela Frederick, survived Mr. Wilma Lorenza Tyson Sr., age 79, of 144 Georgia Highway 308, Plains, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Wilma Lorenza Tyson Sr., age 79, will be held Monday, December 2nd at 11 a.m. in the sanctuary of the Lebanon Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher O'Brien, pastor, his pastor, the Reverend Shirley Straughter, pastor of the St. John AME Church in Plains, Georgia, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Lebanon Cemetery in Plains, Georgia. Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson, age 79, of 710 Meadow Drive, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, November 27th at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted children, Miss Candace Henderson of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Norma Johnson and her spouse, Mr. Alex Johnson of Warner Robins, Georgia. 16 beloved grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, her loving sibling, Mrs. Leslie M. Crawford and her spouse, Mr. Jack Crawford of Atlanta, Georgia, Miss Doris Payne of Florida, Mr. Robert Corbin and his spouse, Mrs. Margaret Corbin of Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Eddie James Corbin and his spouse, Mrs. Belinda Corbin of Atlanta, Georgia, Mrs. Ethel Taylor and her spouse, Mr. Harvey Taylor of Macon, Georgia, and Miss Annie Corbin of Macon, Georgia. Her beloved in-laws, Miss Leela Rogers and her husband, Mr. Cecil Rogers of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Larry Henderson and his spouse, Mrs. Donna Henderson of El Paso, Texas, and Mother Mary Ruth Henderson of Cordele, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include her devoted friends, Brother Artist and Mrs. Helen Oliver of Cordele, Georgia. Survived Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson, age 74, of 710 Meadow Drive, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson, age 74, will be held Thursday, December 5th at 11 a.m. at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah Witnesses in Cordele, Georgia. The burial will follow at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. The public visitation will be Wednesday, December 4th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home. Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker, age 81, of 1702 Drayton Lane, Cordele, Georgia, died Friday, November 29th at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Willie Frank Walker of Cordele, Georgia, her loving and devoted children, Mr. Jeffrey Lucas of Lithonia, Georgia, Mr. Roderick Walker, and Mr. Latravius Walker of Athens, Georgia, Ms. LaWanna Davis of Cordele, Georgia, and Mrs. Latricia Taylor and her spouse, Mr. Rodney Taylor of Byram, Georgia, her beloved grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her beloved sisters, Mrs. Francine Sheffield of Albany, Georgia, Mrs. Deborah Lynn Armstrong, Miss Benita Applin, and Mrs. Dorothy Lucas of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Rolita Applin, United States Navy retired of Jacksonville, Florida, Miss Priscilla Lucas, Miss Martis Lucas, and Miss Valerie Lucas, all of Chicago, Illinois. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Larry Applin, Mr. Quincy Lucas of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Michael Applin of Albany, Georgia. Her beloved aunt, Mrs. Annie James Bunch. Her beloved uncles, Mr. Ronnie Riggins of Tampa, Florida, and Mr. Willie Riggins Jr. of Detroit, Michigan. Her beloved in-law, Miss Mary B. Applin, Miss Ida Ruth Bryant, and Mr. Lawrence Stokes of Cordele, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survived Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker, age 81, of 1702 Drayton Lane, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker, age 81, will be announced at a later date pending the completion of the arrangements. Miss Annie Mae Allen, age 78, of 1614 North Jackson Street, Americus, Georgia, died late Saturday night, November 30th, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted daughters, Miss Sandra Walford and Miss Shirley Allen, both of Americus, Georgia, Miss Angela Allen of Perry, Georgia, and Miss Erica Allen Davis of Plains, Georgia. her beloved son-in-law, Mr. Tyrone Davis of Plains, Georgia, her beloved grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her loving and devoted sisters, Miss Maddie W. Allen of Americus, Georgia, Pastor Mary Etta McFarland and her spouse, Elder Frank McFarland of Lee County, Georgia, and Mrs. Ida W. McDuffie and her spouse, Mr. Walter McDuffie of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a host of beloved nieces, nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Annie Mae Allen, age 78, of 1614 North Jackson Street, Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Annie Mae Allen, age 78, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The Jwwilliams funeral directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Friends, that concludes our funeral notices for this morning. And as always, we do remind you concerning our pre-funeral arrangements planning available at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home, with packages available with a single pay, a 3-year pay, a 5-year pay, and a 10-year pay. So please stop by and talk with us concerning your pre-funeral arrangements needs available at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home. And also whole life insurance is available at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home.
And now for announcements. The Gospel Stars of Lilly, Georgia will celebrate their 40th anniversary today, Sunday, December 1st at 3 o'clock p.m. at the Turkey Creek Baptist Church in Lilly. Everyone is invited to come and join in the celebration. The Friendship Baptist Church of Pinehurst annual Christmas program will be held on Wednesday, December 4th at 7 o'clock p.m. Sister Cassandra Askew, Secretary, Sister Nanny Bird, Church Mother, Reverend Joseph Atkins is the pastor. Freedom Harvest Worship Center of Leslie, Georgia will celebrate the 14th anniversary of its pastor, Dr. Georgia Daraso, today, beginning at 2 o'clock p.m. Whole Truth Ministry and Pastor George Frank Muntz will be the special guest. Everyone is cordially invited to attend. Dr. Georgia Daraso is the pastor. The Zion Hope Baptist Church invites everyone to the installation service of Pastor-elect Reverend Wesley S. Ashton on Sunday, December the 8th at 3 o'clock p.m. Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of Great Mars Tabernacle Baptist Church, will deliver the installation service. Mother Bernice Wiley, Church Mother, Deacon James Cooper, Chairman of Deacons, Reverend Wesley S. Ashton, pastor-elect. The Davis Chapel CME Church Family and Friends Day will be observed on Sunday, December the 8th at 10 o'clock a.m. Reverend Nelson Maynard Jr. will be the guest speaker. Everyone is invited to attend. Dinner will be served. Stewart Ruby Barrett, Chairman of Stewards. Reverend Arnell Wilburn is the pastor. The St. King Baptist Church will honor First Lady Patricia L. Burnham on Sunday, December the 8th at 10:15 a.m. Reverend Joyce A. Daniels, co-pastor, will deliver the message. Genesis Musical Group will provide the selections. First Lady Patricia Burnham, clerk. Reverend Joyce Daniels, assistant pastor. Reverend Woody C. Burnham is the pastor. The regular monthly meeting of the Cordial Chris branch of the NAACP will be held on Sunday, December the 8th, beginning at 4:00 p.m. Everyone is cordially invited to attend. Those interested in becoming members are also invited to come and be a part of this meeting as well. Everyone is cordially invited to worship at the Greater Mars Tabernacle Baptist Church today, with worship service beginning with Sunday school at 9:00 a.m., a worship service at 9:30 a.m. Everyone has a cordial invitation to attend. Mother Mary Henderson, Church Mother, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Chairman of Deacons, Dr. Jwwilliams is the pastor. The Assembly Baptist Church extends a cordial invitation for you to worship with them today during their worship service, which begins at 10:30 a.m. Deacon Johnny Wilson, Chairman of Deacons, Reverend Cecil Strother is the pastor. You're cordially invited to worship at the New Oak Grove Baptist Church today. Worship service begins with Sunday school at 9:15 a.m., worship service at 10:00 a.m. The Greater Gum Creek Baptist Church extends you a cordial invitation to worship with them today. Worship service begins at 10:30 a.m. Mother Norma Solomon, Church Mother, Reverend Joseph Hockenbrook is the pastor. Everyone has a cordial invitation to worship at the St. Paul Presbyterian Church today. Worship service begins at 11:00 a.m. Pastor Owita Hegman is the pastor. You're cordially invited to worship with the Mount Calvary Baptist Church today. Worship service begins with Sunday school at 9:45 a.m., worship service at 10:45 a.m. Deacon Leon Spears, Chairman of Deacons, Reverend Isaac H. Owens is the pastor. You're invited to worship at the Emmanuel Baptist Church today. Sunday school at 10:00 a.m., worship service at 11:15 a.m. Bible studies held each Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Mother William McGill, Church Mother, Reverend Gregory Williams is the pastor. That concludes our announcements for today.
It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Retired educator, past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas, age 90, of 712 East Pine Street, Vienna, Georgia, died Sunday, November 24th at the Emory St. Joseph Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for retired educator, past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas, age 90, will be held today, Sunday, December 1st at 2 p.m. in the sanctuary of the Bethel Baptist Church in Vienna, Georgia. The pastor, the Reverend Dr. Bobby G. West, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zellner, age 70, of 314 West Madison Avenue, Ashburn, Georgia, died Sunday, November 24th at Purity Health in Ashburn, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zellner, age 70, will be held today, Sunday, December 1st at 2 p.m. in the chapel of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend James Braswell will officiate. The burial will follow at the Westview Memorial Gardens in Ashburn, Georgia. Mr. Wilma Lorenza Tyson, Sr., age 79, of 144 Georgia Highway 308 Plains, Georgia, died Friday, November 22nd, at the Phoebe Putnam Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Wilma Lorenza Tyson Sr., age 79, will be held Monday, December 2nd at 11 a.m. in the sanctuary of the Lebanon Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher O'Brien, pastor, his pastor, the Reverend Shirley Straughter, pastor of the St. John AME Church in Plains, Georgia, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Lebanon Cemetery in Plains, Georgia. Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson, age 79, of 710 Meadow Drive, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, November 27th, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson, age 74, will be held Thursday, December 5th, at 11 a.m. at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah Witnesses in Cordele, Georgia. The burial will follow at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. The public visitation will be Wednesday, December 4th, from 1 until 5 p.m. at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home. Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker, age 81, of 1702 Drayton Lane, Cordele, Georgia, died Friday, November 29th, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker, age 81, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mrs. Annie Mae Allen, age 78, of 1614 North Jackson Street, Americas, Georgia, died late Saturday night, November 30th, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americas, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Annie Mae Allen, age 78, of 1614 North Jackson Street, Americas, Georgia, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The Jwwilliams funeral directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Our program this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones were laid to rest during the past week. The family of Mr. Buford Royal Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Dr. James Wardell Bolton II of Macon, Georgia, and Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Army veteran, the Reverend Eddie B. Childs of Atlanta, Georgia, and formerly of Pinehurst, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Emma Lee Morgan Collier of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Aline Adams Fields of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Jack James Lane Jr. of DeSoto, Georgia. Our program is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones will be laid to rest during this week. The family of retired educator and past assistant superintendent of the Dooley County School System, Mr. David Earl Thomas of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Shirley Dukes Zellner of Ashburn, Georgia. The family of Mr. Wilma Lorenza Tyson of Plains, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Eloise Corbin Henderson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Jessie Lucas Walker of Cordele, Georgia. the family of Mrs. Annie Mae Adams of Americus, Georgia. This election is dedicated to all of the sick and shut-in, to all patients in the local and surrounding hospitals, nursing homes, and rehabilitation centers, to our beloved ministers and their devoted family members, to all retired educators, to the men and women serving in our armed forces, both stateside and abroad, to all veterans, and to everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. The program goes out in memory of our past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams, to my wife, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, to my son, Jai Wilkerson Parker. This election goes out to my brother, retired Chief Master Sergeant Norman F. Dexter, and his wife, Dr. Gwendolyn Maxine Dexter, and their grandson, Noble. Goes out to my sister, Mrs. Patsy Jackson, and her husband, Mr. Jim Jackson of Cordele, Georgia. The selection goes out to my nephew, Deacon Kenneth Smith, Program Chairman of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, and with us this morning presenting our program on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Goes out to our pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church, and to his wife, Sister Kathy Williams, and the entire Williams family of Cordele and Albany, Georgia. This selection goes out to our friend and brother of long standing, the Reverend Johnny B. Dean, pastor of the New Poplar Spring Baptist Church of Byronville, Georgia. Goes out to Brother Deacon Jimmy Charles Mumphrey and his wife, Mrs. Carol Mumphrey, and the entire Mumphrey family. Deacon and Mrs. Sam Mumphrey and family. Goes out to our beloved Mrs. Easter May Sanders and family. Goes out to Mr. Cleveland R. Lemon, the oldest staff member of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home. Goes out to Deacon James Smith and family, Deacon George Jordan and family, Mr. and Mrs. Willie James Patrick and family, Mother Willie Mae Leary and family of Hatley, Georgia, Mother Martha Westbrook and family, Miss Willie Mae Crapp and family, Deacon Jake and Sister Mary Reese and family, Deacon James and Dr. Elizabeth Maddox and family. And again, goes out to happy 23rd anniversary to Mr. Johnny and Mrs. Barbara Dennis, who celebrated their anniversary Saturday, November 30th. Dedication requested by their beloved daughters and grandchildren, the Dennis and the entire McGill family. Happy birthday to Mr. Drapier McGill, chairman of the Chris County Board of Assessors, who celebrated his birthday Wednesday, November 27th. Dedication requested by his wife, his children, his beloved mother, the McGill and Royal family. Happy birthday to Miss Tiffany Odom Johnson, who celebrated her birthday Wednesday, November 27th. Dedication requested by her husband, Mr. McKeith Johnson, her children, and the entire family. Happy birthday to Mrs. Rakitha McGill, who celebrated her birthday Thursday, November 28th. Dedication requested by her parents, her sister, the entire McGill family. Happy birthday to Mr. Edward Earl McGill, who celebrated his birthday Friday, November 29th. Dedication requested by his daughter, grandson, his beloved mother, and the entire McGill family. And happy birthday to Miss Della Westbrook, who celebrated her birthday Saturday, November 30th. Dedication requested by her children, grandchildren, and the entire Westbrook family, her brother, Chairman Deacon Roger Westbrook, and the entire family. I also say happy birthday to Miss Della. Our program goes out to the Reverend Willie Earl Lockett and Sister Helen Lockett and family of Albany, Georgia. Goes out to the Reverend Dion Jones and family, Mrs. Aletha Askew, church clerk and trustee of the New Oak Grove Baptist Church. And again, to each and everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning, it's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. God bless you this first Sunday in December 2024. God bless you.